Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keith, Sara Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Canadian context. On February 13th, we recorded a live webinar with Petra Dolata, an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Calgary. Our topic was the history of energy transitions and what lessons we can apply from past ones to our current energy transition. David, Sara, and I really enjoyed the conversation, and we hope you do too. Here's the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 5, Episode 8 of Energy versus Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and as always, I'm joined by my co-hosts, Sara Hastings-Simon and David Keith. Human history is marked, in part, by energy transitions, and that reflects our evolving relationship with different energy sources and their uses. From the harnessing of fire by early humans to the Industrial Revolution's command of coal and later our mastery of oil and natural gas, different eras in human evolution or human civilization have been marked by shifts in technology, economic drivers, and societal needs. Now we're in the midst of an energy transition that's born of our concerns about environmental damage and resource depletion and climate change, though, of course, the end point of this transition is still very much a question mark. Understanding past energy transitions should be useful to us when trying to navigate the complexities of this current one, even if, as the disclaimer on your investors prospectus goes, past performance is not necessarily indicative of future results. So what does the history of energy tell us about energy transition? And can we learn from the past, or will we repeat the same mistakes? And what do people get wrong when they're trying to extract lessons from the history of energy and energy transitions? So today we're very excited to have Sara's University of Calgary colleague, Petra Dolata, on Energy versus Climate with us to help answer those questions. So a bit about Petra. She is an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Calgary. Her research examines the 1970s energy crises, transatlantic energy relations, and the historical connections between deindustrialization and energy transitions. She is a former Canada Research Chair in the history of energy, and she held previous academic positions at the Freie Universität Berlin in Germany and at King's College London in the UK. She's also co-convener of the Energy and Society Working Group at the Calgary Institute for the Humanities. Welcome, Petra.
Well, thank you. And it's great to be here on Energy versus Climate.
Wonderful. It's great to have you. So, Petra, let's get down to it. You know, we bandy about the term energy transition very often, yet we rarely define it. So before we get into the history of it, could you help us to nail down the term first? What exactly is an energy transition?
There are many definitions out there, and we also use it as an analytical concept. But the one thing that I would see as a core piece of any sort of definition that can be expanded and adapted is that energy systems are always social systems, and energy transitions means changes in the overall constitution of an energy system that is conceived of as a technological, economic, social, and cultural way of ordering society and politics and economics around a particular way of dealing with energy, using energy. So it is an energy system that is changing considerably, but the note the historian would like to always add is energy system here means also social and cultural systems.
Great. Well, I feel like I'm a student in the history of energy transitions 101. I'm a first-year student. And so as a first-year student, I'm wondering, is there a codified list of energy transitions that historians like yourself generally agree upon? And I'm going to give you a simple linear list, but you know, we mastered fire when we were hunter-gatherers, and then other forms of biomass and hydro when we settled into farming communities. And then, of course, the major transition to coal, to power steam engines and manufacturing processes. And then, of course, the smorgasbord of energy sources that came after that, you know, in the late 19th century through to today, and oil and gas and nuclear and and renewables first among them. So is that a good starting list, or is it too linear? But what are your thoughts?
It's absolutely a good starting list. So most historians agree that there has been over time a fundamental shift from what someone, an author called E.A. Wrigley, has called an organic energy regime based on biofuels and anything that's organic material, to one that we call a mineral energy regime. So that's moving into fossil fuels. That's something that most historians see. It is very significant because it really sort of has less basis on the availability of land. If you think about, fossil fuels as something that is kind of in the subterranean. And so there's a famous book that's called The Subterranean Forest. And what happens from this organic system to a mineral system is that all of a sudden we are able to harness a lot more energy because it's no longer just connected to the availability of land. If you think about, forests, you can either use them for construction of houses or agriculture if you actually clear the forest, or you use the wood for energy. And so for a lot of historians that look at the, deep history or the long history of energy transitions, that always limited on how much you can sustain on the basis of energy. And so that's one that we all agree on. There are other ways to look at it. There's, for example, environmental historian J.R. McNeill, who rather looks at somatic energy systems to extrasomatic energy systems. So those systems that are really based on just human power, muscle power, and then move into something that is outside the human body. There are very intricate ways of looking at this. I mean, Václav Smil, who is not a historian, but has very much influenced our discussions, the geographer, he kind of looks at energy transitions as something that combines the way that energy sources, prime movers, which convert these sources and uses, becomes an ever more complex system. So if we go back thousands of years, it was, one energy source, sort of a human prime mover, essentially, our muscles, translate that into one single use for this. And what has happened over time is that we get more energy sources, we get more intricate prime movers, which move to animate powers, think oxen, horses, and all these, to inanimate prime movers. First mechanical, wind power, water power, even sails, these kind of thing, kinetic, to something that is much more complicated, or technologically supported. And we also have multiple uses of energy where it's very early on, it's sustaining us with food, it's heating, it becomes more and more complex as we move on. So that's a very interesting way of looking at it. And it could subsume all the energy transitions you just mentioned under it, and we can look at these. The last one that I think most historians agree is that we need to be very careful whether we talk about substitutions, additions, rather than transitions, because one of the easy things to forget is that while there might be changes in the share of particular energy sources in an overall energy mix, at the same time, we may also increasingly use energy. So that's kind of two historical stories that you need to bring together. We move towards an increasingly high energy society, while at the same time, the share of certain energy forms changes. So what this means is that a famous single fuel energy transition from coal to oil, which is something that, in the mid-20th century, a lot of Western countries went through, it's not really a substitution, because it's not that in absolute terms coal production dipped. What happened is that we used more and more energy for more and more uses. And at the same time, it was more oil was used in terms of the shares, but we never really stopped producing coal or using coal. So this is the thing for a historian that makes it so fascinating, because at different levels of time, if you will, that play into understanding in your very linear fashion that you proposed, the way that energy transitions proceed. So you can have energy transitions over centuries, right? You can also have energy transitions that are part of a lived experience. People that are affected, for example, by the switch from coal to oil. So this makes for very different histories.
Got it. And thanks. You've given us some useful dichotomies to chew on as well: organic, mineral, animate, inanimate, somatic to extrasomatic. And what I gleaned from that is, I gave this simple linear example, but you can have a number of different transitions occurring simultaneously, of course. Now, coming back to over centuries versus lived experience, how does a historian approach energy transition, and how does it differ from a historical approach that a historian would take to, say, other major developments in human civilization?
In the past, it's been very evident that most historians who would work and research energy transitions really came either out of economic history or sometimes political history. What this meant is that they were much more familiar with looking at these larger time periods, at cyclical developments, say, think business cycles and all this. It's also, those are the kind of historians who will work with a lot of statistical data when it is available. That is also the reason why we have a lot more, of course, on that sort of major switch that comes about through industrialization. But more recently, in the last 10 to 15 years, it's really important to note that many other historians are interested in the history of energy transition, and most of them are not economic historians. So they are much more interested either in bringing the scale down, as I mentioned, to the lived experience. So these are questions about what do energy systems look like as social systems, and how does an energy transition impact the entire social and cultural system that's based and built around a particular way of energy informing our daily lives. So those researchers who, for example, are part of the whole petrocultures sort of movement, right? Trying to understand how 20th century, 21st century societies, most of them are really defined through the use of oil, even though it's not entirely based on oil. And how is that particular culture driven by understandings and narratives and stories that are linked to that? That's one way. Or equally, we have other historians who are coming out of, say, environmental history, who even go further up the macro. So rather than looking at, these kind of economic cycles and how this will, even ideas around innovation, diffusion, they are really interested in almost deep time understandings of energy transitions. For example, as the Anthropocene, as something that, how does this impact whole civilization? You mentioned this, right? There is this idea of the use of energy really defines the kind of civilization, the possibilities that are there. So it's a very long answer to your question, but it is important to realize that there are many different historical subdisciplines that will look at energy transition in a very particular way. And they differ in the timelines, they differ sometimes in the geographies, and they also differ definitely in the scale, whether it's a micro, a medium, or a macro scale. And that is important because they will look at very different sources. Data, statistical data is only one of many sources that historians are interested in. So if you're on the micro level, what you are interested in is the lived experience. You might do oral histories even. You might try to understand, well, what did it look like being both a consumer and producer of energy, say, if you study coal mining in certain regions. So there is a very different way that historians can look at this. What they all share is to look at energy transition as an analytical term. And that's very important because we do two things with energy transition. We use it as an analytical term to kind of try and compare different time periods, different scales, but we also bring it back as what we call a source concept. So this is the idea of, where do I actually find it in my primary sources? When do people in the past, rather than me looking at what happens in the past, when do people in the past themselves talk about something as energy transition? So these are, and sometimes that's confusing, because you're using the same term, but in two very different ways, as analytical concepts to help you structure your research, or as a source concept, as something that you try to find in your primary sources, if it's not data, right? If it's text-based, which most of us are pretty much text-based. The economic historians are not necessarily, the most prominent, although they seem to have been in the study of energy transition.
Yeah, and I just wanted to make a comment on that before we kind of move on to some questions about what lessons we can draw. But I think that data point is interesting because the way that, I hear you talking about how historians approach this, I think is very different from the way that historical information is informing the decisions that we make and the sort of trajectories that, we, or sort of whatever the political discourse or this kind of discourse around where we might be going with our energy systems, which seems to be very dominated by that data piece. And I'm sure there's all kinds of, social scientists who can tell one better than I can about why that is. But at least in terms of what happens is that there seems to be this very intense focus on models and trying to kind of model the facts and the use of that data. And that, I think, is going to give us one type of picture around the future of energy.
One of the things that I take from the literature on energy transitions, meaning the transitions in primary energy and prime movers, and from other literature on technology diffusion, is this persistent thing that later transitions that happen later, that is in, say, countries or regions that happen later, happen faster. Do you buy that?
To a certain extent, it depends on what kind of energy transition you actually look at. And those examples are often particular energy transitions that are based on technological shifts. So they're much more around those that focus in on the introduction of particular prime movers. And so they borrow, of course, from the literature that looks generally at innovations and early adapters and latecomers and the advantage of those that come in later. So in that sense, I can see that, but it is limited to those specific energy transitions that are studied mainly as being driven by technological progress in the prime movers. And so I think this is one of the problems that we have. It's a lot easier to talk about energy transitions when you can make it along data points, around technology, rather than something else that is a lot more intangible, if you will, because it's more about, the way that societies think about certain things, what they understand as progress, how they see themselves as consumers.
So I'm not a technological determinist. So there's certainly, obviously, there are examples of very fast transitions that seem very tied to prime movers. I mean, horses to cars feels like the sharpest one, where we had a really high energy civilization with long distance transport by rail and with electricity and chemical industry. We had all that thing, but what we didn't have was a small machine that could do the last mile. So we had long distance rail transport, but everything within a radius in a city was by horses, until suddenly when cars came in, you get this transition that in some US cities has a time constant of like 3 years. It's just unbelievable. So that's an example that is fast. Are there good counter examples where you have much later ones going slower, where it's the same kind of transition, that is in terms of coupling to long distance transport?
Well, and I would come back to your first example there, because I mean, you had a lot between the horses and the cars, which were, trams, or, you go from horse-drawn tram lines to electrical tram lines that you have there. And I especially the example of the car is one that is just so much more complex, because part of the story behind that very quick ascendancy of the car that's fueled by gasoline, right? As opposed to, because at the beginning we had steam powered cars, we had electric cars, and we had gas powered cars.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, we know. Yeah. But
well, I know, but I mean, the point that I would make as the historian is to say the reason why there was so much push from those who actually are in the oil business in the early 20th century was that they were losing their one big market, which is kerosene, which is for lighting, to electricity. And so
I mean, the big driver was gasoline was a waste product because they were basically the kerosene for lighting was the primary product. But yeah, obviously I said that there was trams and electricity, but what there wasn't was a small thing that could do delivery in cities. And that was the thing where they had, this all that done by horses. And there was like this one kind of, in hindsight, but I think pretty strong kind of hole in the energy system that we didn't have a prime mover that could do that job.
Yeah, I mean, the historical literature would say that you still first have to create an understanding of society that this is the piece that is missing, and that this is the thing that would make your life easier, and that is actually much more that this idea that this fits perfectly the demand that was there is not often historically a lot more complex, because we also know that people don't necessarily quickly jump onto these changes. So there needs to be some particular champions of that story of saying, what you're missing here is this piece. It's like, this is taking too much time. This is far too cumbersome, because most people would not necessarily recognize this. And so there's an entire other part of the story where you need to have people who actually create, right, a whole narrative around it would be better, it would be more efficient if we did X, Y, Z. It's not that the technology is there and people are like, yeah, wow, this, I've always worried about this part of my life, and now here we are, and this solves it. I think that's the problematic piece, and this is why I do appreciate those who do the really, very sort of over 5 years in a very particular locality, try to reconstruct how did actually that replacement of horse-drawn carts happen? Because also there's a whole infrastructure piece around it, right? It's not just given, okay, we replace that horse-drawn cart by something else. All of a sudden you need room in the city for example, leaving that something else that normally would be somewhere in stables, or there's a whole piece there that I find sometimes it's just forgotten about, and it will be crucial to our energy transition now, because those are the kind of questions that people are, not everyone might necessarily see how this would be a better way of doing things. Why should you change something that you already have and works? So there's a lot more to it that I think is hidden in this story that we can tell afterwards about, yes, of course, we moved from this to that.
Maybe. I don't think that's excessive technological determinism. I think part of it is that people, and I think there's detailed research at the time, that the existing technology was a problem in all sorts of ways in that particular piece of it. And there was writing at the time to demonstrate that. I think it's fashion now to say there's no such thing as technological determinism and it's all just determined by people's fashions, but I don't think that really reflects. I think there's arguments on both sides. I think there's
and I don't want to say
developments of technology really do shape society in ways that matter.
Yeah.
So I'd like to jump in with another do you buy that question, if you don't mind, Petra. And this gets us to some of the lessons that we can draw from looking at past energy transitions. And I think it was Amory Lovins, and I'll have to let the EVC listenership correct me if I'm wrong, but he talked about technological coevolution, and he said that you have these major energy transitions, and they're always accompanied by a technological shift in communications technology as well. So when we move from hunter and gatherer societies to settled farming communities, the writing system and farming communities and using biomass and other waste biomass products for heat, then the writing system accompanied that. With the Industrial Revolution and the use of coal, then the telegraph accompanied that roughly. When we moved to oil and gas, then we moved to the telephone, and then eventually to satellite communications, and now in the internet, we're moving with wind and solar battery storage and renewables, the internet is really fueling that. Do you buy that as well, that you necessarily have these technological coevolutions of communications happening at the same time?
I see them happening. I don't think they have to necessarily happen. I'm not surprised that we have some of these cool developments, because if you conceive of what's happening in energy transitions as large changes in bigger systems, right? Political, economic, social, and cultural, it is not surprising that it's a lot of things that are connected to it. I mean, the way that mobility changes because of energy is something that will have so many other effects, and equally will have to be influenced by some other things. One of the main and interesting aspects of a lot of these energy transitions up to now is that around acceleration as well, right? And so there's a whole new experience with a lot of these energy transitions that allows for different understandings of how the way that we interact with other people also is impacted. So the communication pieces, on the one hand, I feel equally influenced by some of the technology that undergirds the way that these energy transitions happen, but equally that they also help us sort of create a whole new way of understanding of how we, for example, interact and interrelate both with other people, but also with the environment. So it's always difficult to comprehend what it must have been for someone who'd never been on a train, on a steam train in the 19th century, do that for the first time. And we have all these accounts, right? People writing about this, how this is just this nauseating and this having, experiencing landscape at such a speed, which was never possible before. Just trying to imagine what this does to, trying to understand how you fit into that landscape. And these are really closely connected, I find, to some of the communication pieces. So I don't think they necessarily have to be there always together, but I'm not surprised that often they are, both because of they might share some technological innovation, but equally you need that piece as well to make sense of this new world that you may enter.
Some pretty good counterexamples. We were just talking about how horses to cars, but there was no big communication shift at that time. And the first transatlantic cable is in the 1850s, the same time as oil. So oil didn't influence it because it was earlier. And if you think of the recent transitions in communication, it's hard to tie them to energy transition. So I think there's a lot of counterexamples.
To your point, Petra, I wonder if we can go back in time and identify the first kid that got car sick on a family car journey.
Yeah, definitely changed life. I wanted to come back to something. I have a question, but first just an observation, something that from the previous discussion between you and David around kind of this, like, were cars, filling this need everybody had, or was the need created? And it makes me think a little bit around the discourse of my, one of my favorite topics, the e-bike or cargo bike right now, where it feels a little bit like that. And, obviously that, I think that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to, have the same story there, but I do see certain similarities of, like, it's this form of transportation that's really quite different. It serves a different kind of need than we're used to serving. And I guess there's a lot of debate going on now around really, like, is that a need we need to be served? So kind of just something that popped into mind when you were talking about those. The question I have, also, I guess, in this form of a, does the historian buy this? Is there seems to be a lot of discussion around, okay, well, historically, on the one hand, we didn't so much always transition away from sources of energy as we were just adding them. And at the same time, what is the pace of change of that transition? And I think those are both often brought up as, like, well, that means we're not going to be able to, get to net zero, because obviously we are talking about having to transition away. I think we're starting to see some of that, in some signs on the coal side and some of these, at least in certain economies, around the use of oil and others. So maybe there's a little bit of a history, or a little bit of a data there. On the adoption side, I like to put down in my solar class that, when do you call the starting point of solar, right? You could go back to very long ago, and that was when, Albert Einstein figured out the photovoltaic effect. So, do we have maybe a long runway? But I guess, maybe the question to you is sort of how do you take that point of, well, we've never done this before and certainly never at this pace. So therefore, net zero is a pipe dream.
Okay. There's a short answer. As a historian, you're just like, anything can happen, because we can think in centuries, and our problem is not to say, if all these factors are in place, then it will happen. If you ask us, could any of this? Yeah. I mean, we have seen all sorts of things that in the past no one thought would happen. The longer answer is there's a bit of a sort of discussion amongst historians or those who are interested in energy transition, whether it is indeed a protracted affair or whether it is revolutionary. And I think the difference here is what you're looking at. So someone like Smil would always make the point, right, that if you really look at when it was first introduced, and when it really becomes an important share in an energy mix, so as to change the overall energy system, that is often 50 years, 100 years. So that's really a long, protracted development. And that's what leads him to warn, right, about don't be so, don't expect this to happen very quickly. On the other hand, I mean, I'm thinking there's an interesting study by Kanda, Malima, and Ward on sort of European energy transitions. And they are, of course, starting more at how revolutionary, though, are some of these changes in terms of how society changes, right? I mean, if we look at how specific energy transitions massively change how we order society, even how it impacts politics and policy and government, they are revolutionary. And so that's one of the disagreements. The other is indeed, we don't have that many examples in the past where there's a willed energy transition, right? Where governments say, we need to do this. And so it's difficult to compare and to say, studying past energy transitions, which most of the times were not because a state said, or a government said, or a community said, we need to change this. And now here we are talking about an energy transition where we think we have a clear plan for, is really difficult to compare. There's a lot also, of course, that has to do with how far can a state direct some of these? And there are different answers that are given by different historians. There are historians who believe in the power of the state and who think that, industrial policy, all these things can, in one way or another, direct these changes. Or you don't believe in this and say, at the end of the day, there are underlying longer term developments that will bring about the change. What governments try to do, there's so many unintended consequences. There's so many things that actually go counter to what was intended that, we don't know. So it's difficult to say, but I would not be on the side of those who say, because we see how long it took in the past, that there'll never be an energy transition that can be faster. I'm a historian. Why would I say no? I mean, I also am a German, and this idea of there'll never be reunification. Well, the unthinkable can become thinkable. That's the one lesson from history, but it's probably not the one that people are thinking of.
Yeah, if you'd ask Americans in 2004, would the United States ever elect a black president, people had said it would take decades. And then look what happened in 2008. Something that around energy transition, I often hear around the energy transition that we're currently in, and I'll say it's, from folks sort of deep in the heart of oil and gas here in Alberta, is, well, we can't look to past energy transitions because this current one, it's voluntarily imposed upon us, if you will, and that is, we're not replacing a technology that is or was clearly inferior on a range of performance metrics to the new technology that is entering the market. And that new technology, just through consumer demand, is rapidly displacing the old technology. And moreover, this one is fundamentally driven by public policy, whereas in the past, other transitions from, whale oil to coal to oil and gas were really driven by sheer market demand. And the availability of the new technology versus, say, the relative unavailability or costs of the old. What would you say in response to that, Petra?
Well, I would say, first of all, that most of the detailed studies of specific energy transitions will show that it's never just around one thing, like cost, technology. It's all of the above. It's always a combination of many things. And so it's really difficult to make that argument that, in the past, it was like this, and so it's so different from what is here now. One of the examples that I would give is that single fuel transition from coal to oil, which actually there are so many pieces to that story. When I look at it, for example, for the case of West Germany, and a lot of these pieces have nothing to do with the market, that have nothing to do with pricing, that have to do all with politics, that have to do all with specific societal aspects. So in terms of politics, thinking about how, because in the United States in the late 1950s, you had mandatory oil import quotas for oil imported by multinationals based in the US from the Middle East. So they needed new markets. For various cultural reasons, West Germany after 1945 was one of the most open Western markets. So this is where they would go to. The Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan essentially, right, it gave US dollar to Western European countries so that they could buy again US products, commodities, and whatever. That also led to the fact that a lot of oil really sort of, swamped the market in Germany and created a competition for coal that they couldn't win. But already these two examples show you that there's a lot more to that story that is not just, these are sort of market forces writing this. I think one of the biggest pieces that energy historians bring to the table as well is to remind people that energy is at the intersection of markets and politics. It's never just the one or the other. So equally, those who only look at the geopolitics of it, forgetting the market piece. But it is this intersection. So that's the one thing that I would first give as an answer, that you may not really know as much as you think about those past energy transitions before you tell us that today's ones are so different. But the question is also, is it really just public policy and political will? It's so easy to forget that there are generational differences in what people are actually expecting and wanting from future energy systems. That is something that comes out of societies. I mean, here we are, we all of a generation that is probably not as much impacted, or, we don't live as long to see some of this, although we probably may, but it's easy to forget. There's a whole, generation that's leaving this province because, for example, they don't want to be in it. So I think it's an easy cop-out to say this is something that comes from somewhere out there. And it's easy to say, it comes from up there, outside, or whatever. We need to acknowledge that it also comes from, those people who live here and now and have certain ideas about this. And that is something that we've seen in past transitions. Never will people agree on where those energy transitions should go to. And equally, we all need to remember there will always be winners and losers in energy transitions. And the difference is there a security net in place that either the state or communities themselves offer that deal with those things? And so I absolutely understand why people, of course, want to make that point.
Maybe energy transition is the wrong language to use then. Maybe this is really better thought about as pollution. So of course, it's not something from out there. This is a political fight about a pollutant where we're going to restrain ourselves from that pollutant. And if you think about the other, really big ones, the extraordinarily rapid cleanup of air pollution, of water pollution, of some long-lived metals, organochlorines, et cetera. Those are things that were all policy. The policy didn't come from outside. It was fought over. There were people on both sides. Society, it's not clean. It's completely politically driven, since there was no market drive to do those things. And I think that's the way I think about this. It's more like a pollution-driven thing. So I agree with you that in electricity sector, coal versus oil had a lot of politics, because the differences aren't that big. But the differences in coal versus oil for land transportation are huge. And I think our technological determinism really tells you a lot there. There's very hard to imagine a world where we had coal-fired cars.
Absolutely. But I mean, transport in itself, there are other ways of organizing transport, of course, but it will also mean that you massively change the way that, for example, workplaces close to you are not, that, you have certain expectations about being able to do certain things. I think that's where I absolutely agree with you, but equally, using West Germany as an example again, car ownership was very low in the 50s.
Okay, I was wrong to say cars. I just mean transportation. I mean all the things that use liquid fuels for motors. So that's marine shipping, where there was some coal competition, rail, aviation, heavy trucks and cars, and also the thing that in that initial transition actually was the use for internal combustion was not for what we now think of as cars. It was for delivery vehicles and vehicles inside industrial facilities. So that's that whole range of things that were enabled by liquid fuels in a way that I think is close to deterministic. So sorry, I was wrong to get you.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
And I think that's another piece that we often forget. And this is why it's important to come back to this idea of the high energy society. So how much of that energy use is residential versus commercial? Where do we see the changes? So this is, I think, the problem that we have as we focus in on those energy transitions. And I agree with you. I don't particularly like the term either. Yeah. And historically, we also know it really comes up in the 70s as something that we don't like to talk about energy crisis because it's so negative. So let's start talking about something that, brings us to the future, and we'll talk about energy transition. And so yes, there is, of course, in the long run, you can see how this is something that, while not technologically determined, but you see how everything is put in place and makes sense. But it's what is interesting for the historian, because we like the people, the human, the individual, if we're not economic historians, is to really understand, well, how does this play out on a sort of a lived experience? And one of the really exciting things, and that might be useful for our discussions today, is that we are always complicit. So the idea of an energy system being a social system is also a reminder for us that we are part of that system, and the way that we have certain expectations and the way that we want to lead our lives makes us, right, complicit in, for example, this high energy society. And sometimes we are not even aware of this, that because also energy has become so invisible. When you think about it, when, in the early energy systems, you have to do the work. You are right beside an energy source. You see all the stuff that goes into it. Nowadays, we are often so removed. When I ask students, right, about kind of in their daily lives, what kind of energy pieces are happening, most of these we are not aware of. And so I wonder as well in discussing, the new energy transition and the Anthropocene, and not to say that, we should all change, but we need to be very aware of the very complicated, complex situation that we are in as those people who live that energy system that is defined through certain things.
Petra, the lived experience is very different if you're in Alberta and you have an acid gas pipeline crossing your land, as many rural Albertans do. I want to touch upon a bit more of your research in a term that is even less liked than energy crisis or perhaps energy transition, and that's deindustrialization. And we hear about that term. I've heard about it recently a lot, about premature deindustrialization happening in many parts of the developing world now, where people who had left rural areas move to cities for factory jobs are already being displaced by AI and automation. But you've looked at, I think, not premature deindustrialization, but regular deindustrialization in the Ruhr region of Germany. I know you're touching a bit about sort of West Germany, but maybe just, a minute or two on that research in particular and some of the lessons that you've drawn from it. And then, folks, just to give you a heads up, we'll get to audience Q&A after that.
Sure. It's interesting whether it's even might have been a premature deindustrialization because, for various reasons, this already happens in West Germany in the late 1950s. It was essentially West German coal couldn't compete with, as I mentioned, the introduction of oil, but equally also with imported US coal, which, is German coal is much deeper in the earth than US coal. Generally, the wage structure is very different than the late 1950s, still very high earners in West Germany, because they also are seen as fueling Germany's economic miracle. So for various reasons, we have the contraction of the industry already starting in 59. And of course, deindustrialization, you can look at it in two ways. It's the contraction of industry, it's kind of the loss of production, but it's also the loss of employment. And so they don't always sort of go hand in hand. And so what I've been looking at with some other colleagues in a project on deindustrialization is to understand what happens with those many, many workers in the industry if we do see deindustrialization in a Western context. And the example of Germany that we have, and this is why I'm so fascinated by it, looking at what potentially could happen to an Alberta energy industry, is what happens to these people. And there are two things that I find really interesting that comes out of this research. First of all, you really create a political problem if people are not consulted, if people are not part of the conversation, and if people are immediately stigmatized because they stand up for their industry. We have to, whether we like that industry or not, I think we have to acknowledge there is much more related to the industry providing a job and a workplace. Identities are constructed around these industries, even beyond those who are employed by the industry. So that's one of the lessons that we've seen, that you need to bring the people to the table. You need to understand their fears, and you need to acknowledge that there's much more than it's just a job. What if we give you another job? Would that help? The second piece is, in the West German case, but this is also a different time and a different country, both what would be the provincial government and the federal government stepped in and really kind of smoothed that transition. So there was realization that there'll be a lot of people who will no longer have jobs in that industry. So what should happen? On the macro level, for example, new industries were attracted, still in manufacturing. So car manufacturers, Nokia in the 90s, the telephone, that was brought to the region, of course, with subsidies, right? I mean, you're competing with other locations in the world. The second piece was that education became a priority. So our region, the Ruhr region, didn't have universities. That was not, it was an industrial conurbation. So universities was founded. And so that people like myself who come out of mining family, first generations, actually go to these kind of universities and take degrees. And then the third piece was, and that was a massive undertaking between the company and the government, was to make sure that you phase out these people with a social plan. So my dad stopped working at age 53, but he didn't lose his payment. A lot of the younger generations were retrained. And that was all paid for by the government. So for a lot of people, they look towards West Germany as an example that worked, where a whole industry was transitioned out. but without creating the problems that you may have seen in the northern regions of the UK or elsewhere. The caveat is, it worked in Germany and it worked at the time. That doesn't mean that it will work in other jurisdictions and today, because as I said, there's a lot of competition, right? In terms of attracting particular industries, being able to provide subsidies. Also, there's globalization. Most of these countries entered WTO. There are certain rules, with the exception of an escape clause where you can use national security arguments. But generally, you can't just do, right, and throw all the money at those kind of industries. So it's an interesting example that isn't necessarily transferable, but it teaches us a couple of very fundamental lessons. And that is, you need to start planning early. You need to bring in those who will be the ones for whom lives will change. And you will have to respect those kind of positions, not as, as something that people don't understand what's at stake, but as something that this is people's identities. That's kind of, I guess, what the historian can bring to that discussion.
It's a really interesting story. I mean, also the general point that you're making, I take, which is that, the history doesn't have all the answers for us. It's not like there's a blueprint we can follow. But I mean, the one thing that jumps out at me, aside from all those other differences you just listed, is, of course, the very different approach that we see the province taking around that. I noted down, you said realization and planning, that this change is happening. And I remain convinced that is still very much not happening here in Alberta, and honestly, very concerning to me as an Albertan in terms of trying to smooth that transition or prepare for it, at least.
You can't expect the market. I think that's the one lesson that we have seen. You cannot expect the market to correct that.
Yeah, just put a plug in for a past show that we did last season with Duray Vino from Hannah, which is a cold transition affected community. If you're interested in the topic, check it out. We had a wonderful conversation. Okay, let's get to questions. And Karen Spencer, you have a question for Petra and the rest of us.
So I'm just thinking back to the major drivers for energy transitions, because we started out talking about historical transitions. And really, Petra, you mentioned, it's a big industrial push where you see, say, the oil companies or whoever pushing it for industrial growth. But I also see on the consumer side, in the past anyways, it's been a real drive to change that, that it's not a luxury anymore, it's a need. Like you said, we all decide we have to live, or it's really, really good to live at a higher level of energy consumption, for example. And now you look at what we're doing, though, and the change really going from, say, fossil fuels to electricity or nuclear or whatever the case may be, is that in the same category? Because the consumer's life is already pretty good. How is the sales job going? And it's tough to incent the consumer. And I know as I wrote that, I was thinking, well, we have the carbon tax here, and instead of incenting the consumer, we're kind of pounding him on the head saying, if you continue to buy this, the price of this is higher. So, showing the differentiation. But it's a tough job, because I don't think we see it as a need or an obvious need anymore for the consumer.
That's a very good question. It's one of those things that differentiates even the 19th from the 20th century, right? That there's so much more disposable income that can go into these things. I mean, there's only a certain amount of things that you will need. But then once you pass that threshold into all those things that you could have, it becomes more and more difficult, right, to create this, or as you mentioned, this idea of the sales job around specific things. But I should mention that even in the 19th century, where we see, of course, you would want to switch from whale oil to something else, because it's a better light. It has all the advantages in terms of comfort. But even that will always take a while to convince people. We know, for example, with the introduction of electricity, that especially in the homes, a lot of women were absolutely anxious about this, because it was a completely different way. They were much more visible, as you can imagine. Before when you have that sort of non-electricity lighting in a house. And this is Victorian time period where you didn't necessarily want to be as visible as you are with electricity, but equally the standards of cleaning changed. Because if, you know, I mean, just think about it. When you laugh, but this is a massive thing that we see in all the diaries of these women who, you know, forerunner that they are, introduce electricity in the homes. And the biggest thing is that now you see everything. So it doesn't even create less work. There are other things around the introduction of washing machines, dishwashers, where the expectation is, and I have to say very often by male advertisers that, you know, this will really sort of make life of the housewife much more convenient. But what they don't consider, though, is it changes certain expectations. So actually it adds a new level of something that, you know, if you have a washing machine, then all of a sudden, you know, you need to do this every second day because the expectation is now very different in terms of how clean certain things are, or around dishwasher. So it's a really, and looking at the consumer, it's not a clear-cut story because we just have so many evidence in the past where people, and we would say, why would they be against this? But, you know, people are not, they're not rational actors, not in the way that economic theory may make them. They don't want the stuff.
Here on that, I'll jump in for 1 second. As the son of a feminist historian who had me reading a book about that upselling of expectations for femininity in households, as they needed to, from the male perspective, needed to get women not working again after the war and kind of reestablish a social order. So yes.
I'm gonna go turn the lights off and realize that I don't have to do any more vacuuming for the rest of the week, I think, as an answer. But I think that point about kind of, you know, how, I guess part of what I take from that is like society's expectations and how that shapes also what is seen as desirable, right? And so there's two things that I would maybe just, you know, add in addition from my perspective as far as like consumer adoption. I think there is this barrier that comes from, we're much more likely to accept kind of the inconveniences that are, you know, we're already used to with a given technology, right? So I like this example with an electric vehicle versus an internal combustion engine vehicle, where, you know, people are sort of used to having to change the oil or get the oil changed in their car every 6 months. And so, you know, when you sort of ask them, well, now if you're going to have to plug your vehicle in, especially say on a road trip, they're more likely to kind of see the things that are newly difficult and not kind of calculate the things that are going to actually save them time, right? And the fact that if they're, you know, driving that car mostly from home and they can plug it in at home, then they may actually spend much less time fueling their vehicle than they do today. But you know, there's this sort of new part to it. I think the other one, and this, you know, is an area that I think people get uncomfortable with, but it comes back to, again, this idea of like, at a certain level, using more energy undeniably improves our standard of living. But I think that there is some ceiling to that, right? And once you have your basic needs met and, you know, your basic needs plus or whatever that is, then it's not always that more energy is going to, you know, make you better off, right? And I think we are approaching that level or, you know, arguably have approached that level, at least for certain people in the population, say in a country like Canada. Of course, there's a lack of equality and all these kinds of things, but I think that's also an important part of the conversation that I am afraid we're running out of time of. So I'll have to hand things back over to Ed.
Yeah, I hate to be the Grinch who's going to shut down the conversation early, but I have some vacuuming to do. So I'm afraid I need to
Good man
to get and do that. So Petra, thank you so much. I really felt that our conversation today, in addition to being a new topic that we've covered, it also helped to brought together other conversations that we've had in the past on EVC. I mentioned our conversation with Dre Vino. I think of Greg Nemeth, University of Wisconsin, when we talked about learning curves and what can and cannot apply to future technology, innovation, and commercialization from solar's rapid penetration, especially in the past 10 years. And I even think of the last one that we had with Kim Stanley Robinson, which if you think was not a history of energy transition, it was a forecast of a potential energy transition that's to your point around West Germany's good job of smoothing energy transitions, that one was anything but smooth. That was a very bumpy ride, but there is a successful energy transition by the end of it. So thanks. You managed to pull together a whole bunch of themes together in one conversation.
Well, thank you.
This episode is going to be available at energyversusclimate.com and on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen. If you have a chance, please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. It helps new listeners to find the show. And some thanks. Thanks to Crystal Hickey. Thanks to Serena Gibson. Thanks to Talia Brunau and our sparkling new producer, Amit Tandon, for all of your support. We're going to be back with a new show in March. I forget the date off the top of my head, but you'll all like it. It will be tackling oil sands and its growth with U of A prof and frequent media commentator Andrew Leitch. And thank you, Amit. It's going to be on March 7th. So we look forward to seeing you then. For now, enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everyone.